So the next speaker is Professor Jürgen Osterhammel from Konstanz Universität, who is a distinguished historian and who will speak on Academies and Public Opinion, some historical reflections.
Yes, thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to be a member of this eminent
and
academy.
Also a member of our academy.
Yes. And this is the first opportunity for me to be useful in a modest way to the academy. I hope I can be useful. I feel quite humble after Professor Engelbrecht's wide-ranging survey because I've never been involved in the management or government of any academy. I'm in a way a grassroots academician. In German there is the word Öffentlichkeitsarbeit, which is the equivalent to public relations. And it's Öffentlichkeit, which means public, and then Arbeit has the element of work in it. That's quite interesting. So it means not working in public, but working the public in a transitive sense. And I've never been involved in working the public. If we had to talk about the present situation only and the future, I think what should be done would have been to add to what Professor Engelbrecht has said, a reading of large passages from the ALLEA discussion paper number 3 of January 2019, titled Trust in Science and Changing Landscapes of Communication. A very interesting, excellent paper with perhaps some problems. We might come back to that in the discussion. Some of you may know it. But I'm an historian, and what I want to do is to speak about what Professor Settis has called the genetic code of academies. In other words, I want to counterbalance the présentisme we've been talking about this morning, and in this it's easy to build upon the excellent talk by Professor Loprieno yesterday. I'm covering a bit of the same ground, but in a different perspective. Now, academies of science present us with a paradox. On the one hand, their basic features have not changed dramatically since the 17th century. Robert Boyle, Leibniz, or later Luigi Lagrange, on visit via time machine, would easily recognize present-day academies as direct successors to the academies they themselves had created. The academy has proved a remarkably resilient type of institution and has, during the past 4 centuries, undergone much less change than its eternal companion, the university. On the other hand, the societal and communicative contexts in which the academy is embedded have changed enormously, especially since the 1960s, and then again with the general spread of digital communication since the 1990s. A structurally conservative institution with considerable potential for adaptability is confronted with challenges of an unprecedented magnitude. I will return to some of these challenges in the final part of my talk. Now, our task would be relatively easy if we were able to narrate 2 separate stories, one story of academies and another story of the public or public opinion, and then in the 3rd step, study their mutual entanglement. However, this is impossible mainly for 2 reasons. First, academies have always been based on a hierarchy of various forms of knowledge and often on a strict dichotomy between the knowledge of superior authority and refinement cultivated inside the academy and the mere opinion prevailing outside its walls. Theorists have disagreed on the assessment of that opinion. They have not always sided unambiguously with higher knowledge, so-called higher knowledge. Since antiquity, the wisdom of the common man and the common woman has been recommended as an antidote to the one-sidedness of the philosophers and scientists' knowledge, a kind of knowledge that is not immune to impracticability, unworldliness, and orthodox ossification. This kind of higher knowledge never remains uncontested. Even the most radically internalist conception of the academy that sees it as an insular community or even a clerisy of the initiated and the chosen few, has to reckon with the academy's other, its non-academic environment. Academies can only define themselves as elite institution in relation to an outside world that is non-elite, and often non-elite in a self-confident way. We may call this world the public. Second, the public is no describable institution in the way any individual academy is. An academy possesses a clear address, the public doesn't. Rather, the public is a framework or a sphere or a subsystem of society where different institutions emerge and operate. For example, newspapers, non-governmental institutions, organizations, or even theaters. It may even be argued that there are only publics and public spheres in the plural, a rich and ever-changing landscape that is becoming more and more differentiated and fragmented in the course of societal evolution, culminating for the time being in the myriad pockets, niches, and bubbles of the internet. In one widely shared view, publics are only discursive constructions of an ephemeral nature. At any rate, one can see and touch an academy, but we cannot see a public unless it is an audience in a room or a crowd in the street. Public opinion is even less tangible and an even more abstract concept. It has always been a cacophonic chorus of voices. Opinions do not easily add up to public opinion in the singular. Since the 1930s, survey research in the shape of opinion polls has claimed that public opinion can be empirically determined through large-scale anonymous questioning and statistical processing of the data thereby obtained. In short, it can be counted and measured. Today, this is big business in the service of commerce and politics. Public opinion has, as we get to know it in the charts and diagrams, is a product of professional pollsters. They inform us, among other things, about the trust or suspicion shown towards science and scientists by the population at large. When we proclaim a crisis of science in society, it is on the basis and in response to that sort of findings and published materials. Now, before I approach the historical aspects of my talk, let me just mention the further difficulty that there is now a huge literature on science and the public in the past and in the present, but very little specifically on academies. So it's not easy to keep a firm focus on academies, and I will try my best. Now, a straightforward connection between the public and, more specifically, public opinion and academies is the observation of academies by those who do not belong to them. In contrast to a professional association or a political party or, in a sense, a church, one cannot simply join an academy by paying membership fees. In contrast to the university and its professors, there is no contractual relation of salaried employment between the academy and its members. The academy is a place where the cash nexus plays hardly any role. It is one of the few institutions left in society that work through peer election, moreover one where the selection process itself is not subject to further review and appeal. It's impossible to sue an academy for membership. Membership is a gift, a grace in a way, and it is not legally enforceable. All this makes the academy look somewhat outdated or even archaic, enhancing its vulnerability. In the wider public, there slumbers a potential resentment against the unaccountably elitist and exclusive character of academies. Perhaps sometime a history of Akademie-Feindschaft, of the hostility towards academies, will be written. One chapter in this history, and it's the chapter already written by Harnack in his great history of the Prussian Academy, would be one that tells the story of how during the revolution of 1848-49, the Royal Prussian Academy of Sciences was vehemently attacked by Democrats as a pillar of the established order. Similar incidents happened elsewhere. Now, could academies still be put on the defensive? Yes and no. Yes, since many academies are funded by the state, and it is at the discretion of the ruling powers to doubt the relevance of academies and to curtail support for them. This can happen in many countries at any time. And no, because, as Professor Engelbrecht has already indicated, because anonymous public opinion probably has not so much interest in academies. There are now plenty of sondage about popular attitudes to science, scientists, experts, and so on, but very few, if any, about the image of academies, or one particular academy, in the public eye. This is hardly surprising, since given the fact that academies nowadays are less visible than in times when they and a small number of universities were the only institutions where scientific excellence was concentrated. In an academic market in which a great number of universities, independent research institutes, think tanks, and organizations on a supranational level are ceaselessly competing for attention and resources, academies are just one type of player among many others. They are probably not very well known, even among the educated public, and therefore less likely to draw criticism of an anti-elitist and populist kind. Still, academies have good reason to care for their public image, as everybody else has. What was the role of the public during the long foundational period of academies, that is mainly in the 17th and 18th centuries? First of all, we have to think of the internal public of the academy, comprised of its resident members who came together as equals in an enclave of egalitarianism embedded in a rigorously ranked society. The members came with their individual interests and abilities, though for a very long time and until modern disciplines emerged. We have heard about that yesterday, which is not before the 19th century. They typically remained universalists, able to engage in all kinds of learned conversation. There was no need for interdisciplinarity. The early academies were modern, in the sense that they combined nearly all conceivable functions related to secular knowledge. Secular because theology mostly was kept outside the academies. Whereas universities typically reproduced and taught existing knowledge, the academies generated new knowledge. They became sites for experiments that had so far been conducted in private homes. Only in the later 19th century did natural science research again emigrate from the academies. The internal public of the academies was dominated by the spoken word. Scientific results were communicated to the fellows through lectures. Academies differed as to whether their meetings were open to an external public of listeners and spectators. In any case, from the very beginning, the work of academies was watched keenly by outside scholars, members of an emerging republic of letters that in the long run covered the entire European continent. The cosmopolitan republic of letters in many ways anticipated today's seamless, though not unequal, world of global science. Scholars from everywhere turned to the academies both as sources of new knowledge and, which is often forgotten, as arbiters that had acquired the prestige and authority to judge the validity of any kind of knowledge. It was common practice that non-members submitted papers that were read and discussed at meetings of the academicians. Thereby, and through a dense web of correspondence in all directions, the academies became hubs of scholarly activity at a time when universities did not compete in any of these fields. Even though they were exclusive and elitist in their membership, and of course hardship of travel made it difficult for non-local members to attend meetings, they were able to suffuse the scientific activities of cities, provinces, and entire kingdoms. The academies were not only observed, they were themselves eager to cultivate their relations with the external scholarly community, mainly through making available their proceedings in print. In this sense, they created, and this is an important argument, they created their own public. In the 18th century, they began to award prizes and medals and organized highly publicized essay competitions where a theme was set and submissions invited from anyone who felt up to the task. The Academy's particular modus operandi derived from their dual sources of origin, self-organization and state sponsorship. This innovative combination distinguished the academies from universities with their old corporate privileges. An academy was a corporation where privilege did not rest so much in the institution itself as in the elite status of its individual members. The monarchical state, and academies seem to have flourished less in the few republics that existed in Europe, used the new academies for two of its own purposes. First, to increase its cultural capital through attracting outstanding scholars. For example, the Imperial Russian Academy virtually consisted only of foreigners, non-Russians. And second, to gather expertise for practical purposes. The major addressee and beneficiary of the Academy's advice was the monarch himself or herself, in a way, a special kind of one-person public. The academies developed plans, for example, for infrastructural development. They accepted research assignments from the prince, organized geographical expeditions, and so on. They sometimes provided, through their networks, personal contacts on behalf of the state at a time when diplomatic services were still rudimentary. Access to the ruler was often fairly direct, whereas in present-day democratic countries, academies typically address the general public rather than give, although of course, as we have heard, they do this too, rather than give advice behind closed doors to ministers or their staff. In the early modern period, many of them had an immediate connection to high dignitaries at court. A separate media public, apart from the readers of scholarly publications, did not yet exist. Since the middle of the 18th century, at first very slowly, the universities began to assume functions that had traditionally been monopolized by the academies. The entire 19th century was a period of fruitful competition. While the academies by and large changed very little, the universities, institutions of a vastly different kind, began to profit from two of their own peculiarities. First, they began to organize themselves according to a strict division of labor. Gone were the days of the universalists. It is no coincidence that Alexander von Humboldt remained a quintessentially academy person. He was never a professor, not in the new research university established by his brother Wilhelm. The new principle, strongly supported by Wilhelm von Humboldt, was Fachlichkeit, the idea and practice, we heard about that yesterday, of the discipline that could expand in time and sprout as it does today. This is a very fruitful concept, although it may be now in crisis, as we have heard. Disciplines sprout sub-disciplines, obviously an ongoing process. Second, the university became part of emerging systems of education. This meant that universities were able to systematically recruit young researchers, whereas the academies continued to rest on the proven excellence of senior scholars. More and more, the academies depended on reputations previously gained in the university, or since the early 20th century in independent research institutions. In time, it became unthinkable for a private or gentleman independent scholar to be elected ordinary member of an academy. The expansion of literacy and a reading public, of the book market, and of quality newspapers during the 19th century meant that the quasi-monopoly of the academies on scientific publications ceased to exist. Thus began the long rise of the disciplinary journal, the Fachzeitschrift, to the prominent and uncontested position it enjoys today. Hardly any scholar nowadays would prefer publication in the yearbook of an academy to that in an international A journal. A related development was that what is often called popularization. According to a model that is now widely considered obsolete, true science was popularized and often vulgarized in order to make it comprehensible to the growing audience of bourgeois readers and also the self-educated members of the working class. In place of this diffusion model or trickle-down model, historians of science nowadays prefer to see a close and interactive connection between professional scientists and their various audiences. 19th century fictional and autobiographical literature is replete with medical doctors, apothecaries, and country parsons conducting electrical or chemical experiments in their garden cottages. Collecting botanical or geological specimens was a widespread pastime, and people were encouraged to make systematic meteorological observations and report them to experts. More recent, very recent, ideas of a new citizen science meant to overcome the strict dichotomy between highly specialized experts, perhaps nerds, and a vast majority of lay people barely literate in science basics revive such practices of the 19th century. Until the Great Revolution in theoretical physics around 1900, much of 19th century science and technology had still been basically comprehensible to the educated amateur and needed only moderate simplification and popularization. Much of the popularizing literature, and the elderly Humboldt himself was a very successful practitioner of that genre, kept fairly close to the work of the scientists and did not belong to an entirely different world of media-driven vulgarization. Charles Darwin's books became instant bestsellers. In terms of publics, from about the mid-19th century, two simple models no longer apply. First, the market for scientific knowledge and expertise expanded beyond a small and tightly knit world of learned men, hardly any women. Whereas in the early modern period, when only a minority among the population of Europe was literate, participants in the Republic of Letters inside as well as outside the academies were gentlemen scholars with a shared educational background. The public of the 19th century was much more heterogeneous. The uniform Republic of Letters disappeared around 1800. Second, it would be too simple to posit a deep gap between experts and non-experts. Instead, sociologists of knowledge, following in the footsteps of the famous theorist Ludwig Fleck with his concept of thought collectives, have suggested a more differentiated model consisting of 6 elements. It can be imagined as a cascade of expertise and interest. I should have brought an image to visualize this model, but it consists of 6 different, in a way, thought collectives, concentric circles. At the core, there are the disciplinary scientists who read their own specialist and specialized journals and to contribute to them. Then comes expert circles within the same discipline, but beyond a narrow and specific field of research. Third, scientists at large who are able to grasp and appreciate methods of scientific thinking in disciplines that are not their own. Then sort of break in this six-partite model, a porous borderline between this scientific community in general and the public realm, where now 3 more concentric circles can be distinguished. Fourth, a small public that follows developments in society, in science closely, for example, by reading magazines such as Scientific American. Then fifth, a larger public that takes an occasional interest in science, especially if scientific issues are presented in the media as being relevant to their own lives. And finally, number 6, an even wider public that has no particular interest in science and only takes account of scientific issues when they appear in the main TV news or on the front page of tabloids, for example, climate change at the present time. This model, obviously conceived with the natural sciences in mind, captures the situation that arose in the final decades of the 19th century. It fits quite well much of the 20th century too, when diffusion became stronger than in the period before, and the public was reduced to a more passive role, needing translation and explanation. While it had been possible to understand Michael Faraday or Charles Darwin in their own words, Max Planck or Einstein were harder nuts to crack for the layperson. The sociological model of diminishing expertise and involvement, therefore, has to be augmented by the growing importance of professional mediators, above all, the increasing indispensability of science journalists. In the 19th century, an army of writers explained scientific and technological innovations to a public that had a certain affinity to these innovations. New media in the 20th century enhanced the potentials and possibilities for mediators who almost replaced the individual scientist speaking for himself towards the public. Only very few first-rate scientists in the second half of the 20th century, perhaps Stephen Hawking or James Watson, became celebrities in the way Humboldt, Darwin, or Einstein had been household names in their own time. A new epoch began with regular science broadcasts on television from the 1960s onwards. That format obviously relied on visualization. It is impossible to explain the double helix without showing images of it. Television followed scientists to their places of work, told human interest stories, and incorporated elements of the older nature movie or natural history film. The presentation of science in audiovisual media makes demands on the journalist that are quite different from science reporting in print media. It creates a world of its own and strengthens the power of mediators to pick topics and set agendas. Science journalists, at best, should not be seen as representatives of the public, but as this is my argument now, as third-party mediators between various publics and the different institutions that offer scientific knowledge and authority. The role of academies in this epochal transformation of the public sphere is still very much under-researched. They certainly fulfill at least two unique functions. First, academies embody the unity of Wissenschaft, not just science, but Wissenschaft and this broader German sense of learning across the entire range of disciplines in a way big and complex universities fail to do. Sometimes there is an institutional divide between the natural sciences and the humanities, as in Britain with the Royal Society and the British Academy, established in 1902, which is reserved for the humanities. But still then preserving the unity of the humanities is an important challenge. On the whole, under conditions, as one might call it, of disciplinary fission, more and more subdisciplines, one of the early and original functions of the academies resumes a renewed significance, keeping all branches of scientific knowledge together in one institution that still largely works on the basis of face-to-face interaction. Second, in an imagined world of pure rationalism, scientific reason only has to speak for itself and will easily convince the ignorant and the doubtful through the profundity and clarity of disembodied ideas. This is obviously not how science works in practice. It is always connected to authority and reputation. The question of who speaks is anything but marginal or trivial. The ranking of universities, the prestige of journals, the fame of Nobel laureates, the backing by Bill Gates, all this has an impact on how scientific knowledge is received and esteemed outside scientific institutions. A truth pronounced by a celebrity is not more true than the same truth uttered by a scholar away from the limelight, but it possesses a higher public effectiveness. Moreover, the media create their own experts who, through performative skills and sheer frequency of appearance on the screen, acquire a status and influence largely detached from their scholarly credentials. From this volatile and thickly populated scene, academies stand out as true clusters of excellence. Their age-old principle of self-recruitment of the best by the best translates into a trustworthy reputation that only the topmost universities in a particular country can hope to equal. In contrast to a university with its complex organizations and faculties, departments, institutes, and so on, an academy has much less difficulty in speaking with one voice. Since it pools expertise from many universities and from numerous schools and tendencies of scholarship, it promises a non-partisan cross-section of authoritative views. Through almost ancient methods of reputation building, an academy generates respectability and inspires confidence. The effect is enhanced when several academies, often from a number of different countries, join forces and lend their cumulative weight to issues of exceptional public importance. On the whole, academies are well placed in a competitive market for attention that still puts a premium on perceived authority. But who are? This is my final section. Who are? Now, keeping to the metaphor of buying and selling that some of you in this room may object to, but who are the customers buying such offers? Who listens to academies? The key term in the answer and in the literature that may provide clues to an answer is the media. But how important is medialization? Inferential interpretations of the relationship between science and the public tend to follow general systems theories in seeing the media as the dominant subsystem in contemporary society. According to some views, a new kind of media public took hold as early as the 1920s and has since then made science more and more dependent on the whims of newspaper journalists, radio hosts, TV producers, and internet bloggers. Other theorists suggest that the public is now identical with the media and that science and the media face one another as symmetrical actors on equal terms. In this perspective, science and the media have arrived at a balanced and reciprocal relationship where they offer each other valuable resources. Science would never be able to leave the laboratory and the lecture hall without help from the media. It would remain virtually silent. In reverse, the media may not be intrinsically interested in science and do not take it as seriously as sports or the cinema, but they are aware of the epochal tendency of the rise of appeals to disinterested expertise in many political and societal issues. Quoting a professor may seldom be entertaining, but it certainly is never quite wrong. As a historian, I'm in no position to assess general and theoretical claims about the centrality of the media in modern life and the dependence of science on them. However, I think one should be aware of the danger of regarding the media as omnipotent and as an inescapable shaper or even distorter of scientific information. As any other major organization that communicates with its environment, the Academy nowadays employs trained specialists in public relations. Science journalists, as buyers of scientific news, meet their selling counterparts, the publicity officers of academies and universities. Nobody on either side harbors any illusion as to the power of unaccompanied truth. Simply providing people with more and better information is unlikely to change public opinion on controversial science issues. Such information has to be packaged strategically and launched in a competitive environment. In practical terms, academies, more than ever before, issue voluminous reports and statements on self-chosen topics or on subjects they have been asked to investigate. Many of these documents are now easily and free of charge available online for anyone who cares. This is transparent publicity in an almost heroic Enlightenment sense. No intermediaries interfere between the author and the reader, between the scientist and the citoyen. No bookseller, no library, no censor. But this special kind of public is very small, as it would have been in earlier times, roughly congruent with categories 3 and 4 of the model, the concentric circle model. In other words, confined to experts with a focused interest in particular topics, as well as to a small number of highly educated citizens with a high level of political and cultural awareness and activity. The media come into play when the need arises to boil down a 300 pages report on climate change, demography, energy, or healthcare, or whatever, to a single newspaper column directed at a much wider public, category number 5 of the model. An academy will, of course, provide its own condensed version, while it has no control over if and how the media are going to use it. Media are far from being passive and grateful recipients of data and judgments handed down by Olympian purveyors of wisdom. They actively choose the topics they want to foreground, applying their own rules of preference. Academies may have other ideas than journalists about what are the principal topics of public interest at a given moment in time. The real power of the media is located in their channeling and fine-tuning of attention, not so much of information, but of attention, and in their agenda setting. This happens across a broad range from silence to overheated hype. Up to a point, academies are still able, as they have been from the very beginning of their long history, to form their own publics. These publics are sympathetic, they cherish the authority and impartiality of academies, and tend to grant them priority over competing sources of information. In a word, they are a fan club. Beyond these inner circles, the remoter types of public are more difficult to reach. At the far horizon loom those who defend their preconceived opinions, unpublic opinion, as one might be tempted to say, in defiance of proof and evidence. Creationists, climate change deniers, partisans of what in Italian is anti-vaccinismo, and so on. We have to find better answers, and I'm not going to provide them in this talk, to the question what academies can do to struggle against these frightening forms of obscurantism. Now, my final point is politics. We've heard a lot about politics already from Professor Engelbrecht. Politicians, in a way, are the ultimate target group of scientific communication. They take decisions on innumerable issues, from the economy to technology and the environment, where expert advice is indispensable and frequently sought through formal procedures. Some of these procedures are non-public or semi-public, committee hearings behind closed doors, or routine ministerial consultations of experts as well as lobbyists, fine line between experts and lobbyists, in the course of the legislative process. Focusing exclusively on the media public diverts our attention away from these less conspicuous but highly important channels. Academies can and do play a role here, mostly in collaboration or competition with other actors in the respective field. But what if not just benighted barbarians, but politicians at the levers of power, and don't forget they are the people who control the funding of scientific institutions, if politicians at the levers of power do not welcome advice, when they have had enough of experts, as Michael Gove, the current cabinet minister in charge of preparations for a no-deal Brexit, said infamously in November 2016, to which, if I remember correctly, the then president of the British Academy, Lord Nicholas Stern, replied that a lot of experts will be needed to implement Brexit. This was a clever, but at the same time, a desperately ironic answer. Lord Stern knew quite well that the British Academy would have preferred to give advice of quite a different kind of caliber. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Osterhammel, for your nice talk. If there are questions. Again, Professor Loprieno, and then
Thank you very much, Professor Osterhammel. I would like to ask your opinion on something that I think was implied indirectly in what you said, but you were too scholarly to make it so explicit as I'm going to do it perhaps now, just to submit it to your judgment. And that in fact, one of the difficulties that academies might have in playing precisely this role in the public opinion or in science communication at large is adhering rather strictly still to this concept of cooptation, to the mode of cooptation in the selection of its members, whereas the other institution that, especially in the German-speaking world, was very much based on cooptation, which is the university, has moved towards, let's call it a system or a logic of competition rather than cooptation. So let's say I see a kind of polarity there between a world of the academies where eminence still plays a particular role, and a university that is moving more to the evidence, if you will, side. And do you think that, so we might reach a point in which, to a certain extent, the universities turn out to be the highest competitors of the academies on the public scene? And I observe, for example, the fact that more and more scientists and scholars that are asked to provide opinion or to provide advice, they stress their institutional membership in the university rather their institutional membership in the academy, which for me is precisely a sign of a higher, let's say, social capital that is attributed to the advice or to the position qua being member of a university rather than qua being member of an academy.
Thank you very much. It's an interesting question, and one can really have an empirical take on it by observing how people identify themselves or how they define their multiple identities. And as you say, probably the university scores more points in that sort of in internal rivalry. I mean, it continues this old story of the in a way, friendly antagonism between the story you've been telling yesterday, a friendly antagonism between the academy and the university, but they are different institutions. Their logics are different, and they touch and overlap in certain ways. And probably one of the maybe now, in a way, weaknesses of academies is this meritocratic principle that is difficult to explain, and that has, of course, certain practical consequences. The first thing one is being told after being elected to an academy nowadays is that this is a working academy and that one has to spend quite a lot of time in contributing to the overall projects and goals of the institution. It would be interesting, first of all, to know whether there are still academies that definitely do not define themselves as working academies. What would be the difference? A scholarly gathering in a casual sense, a kind of Platonic, Neoplatonic meeting? Nobody, I think, would prefer that as one's own self-description, but perhaps there are some of them. It's a bit similar in the academies of art, of course. So the field of the academies is a larger one, and the academies of science, of course, operate in the vicinity of academies of arts and literature and so on. And the second thing is, how do these working academies recruit people, and how do they bring them to invest their time in academic context? No? This is one of the backgrounds of your question. The more active a scholar is, the more he or she probably has so many alternatives to working inside the framework of an academy that it is difficult for the academy to gain priority in very tight working schedules.
Professor Portinari.
Thank you very much for your contribution. I have probably nothing to add on the subject. I agree with your reconstruction and your arguments. Only a simple question, a very simple one, but I think for us complicated and disturbing question. You spoke about public hostility to academies, about think tank in our knowledge society, and so on. And what about the objective interactions between academies of science and, I would say, shadow academies of sciences? Akademien der Wissenschaft. I mean, those think tanks which have an increasing influence on our societies, on the public opinion of our societies. Well, this is a question perhaps more for social scientists and political scientists, but also for historians. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Of course, during the long history of academies, they were able to defend their monopoly against any kind of sort of fake competitor. What you are talking about are institutions that mimicry the academy by in a way arraigning to themselves all these symbolic pertinences of that particular and prestigious kind of institution. And indeed, I think there is no copyright on the term academy. I have around the corner a driving school that calls itself the Driving Academy. Well, and it is obviously difficult for great parts of the public to differentiate between this enormous multitude of institutions in the same field. It's also difficult, for example, for one who follows the American scene, to understand the political affiliation of think tanks. Academies, of course, define themselves as impartial and neutral, whereas think tanks often have a kind of, unless they are open partisan, they have a kind of hidden partisan nature, and it's difficult to understand what is behind them and what kind of message they want to convey. So I think they are, some of them, under the label of academy, obviously are obnoxious players in this dark game of false information and creating echo chambers for sort of closed groups. And of course they use the authority or pseudo-authority of the academy to do their doubtful business.
Any more questions? So if not, thank you once more, Professor Osterhammel.